You're listening to the Coast Business Radio podcast.
Phil Honeywood is the CEO of the International Education Association of Australia, or the IEAA, which promotes the benefits of international education. Australia's international education industry is a $40 billion industry. Phil was a member of the Victorian State Parliament and Minister for Tertiary Education, Training and Multicultural Affairs and Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Phil, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mike, and good to be on board.
Does the IEAA get involved in marketing Australian education to international markets?
Well, we have Austrade as the official Australian government marketing arm, and each of our universities and many of our private providers of international education do a really good job on their own bat marketing. We're just going through a whole new nation brand change, and interestingly enough, that's been led by Rebecca Hall, who of course, ran the Queensland Government International Education Division. She was replaced by Shannon Willoughby, that many of your listeners would know of, who ran Study Gold Coast. And Rebecca is now the head of international education for Austrade and has been doing a really good job in getting the new brand up and running, ready for a launch at the start of next year. So there's a combination of education providers and government that do the marketing and recruitment, but certainly my peak body, which covers all public universities, TAFE and private providers, including government high schools and independent high schools as well. Certainly we do our bit as well to really promote Australia as a welcoming, safe and world-class study destination.
Australia's international education sector is demanding all other states follow New South Wales' lead and draw up plans to take in new foreign students soon, warning governments who refuse to commit will face serious questions from universities. How dire is the situation right now, Phil?
Obviously, we've taken a massive hit, and it's not just, for your listeners' sake, it's not just the tuition fees that are affecting education providers. And on the Gold Coast in particular, you've got a lot of private English language colleges. I know Richard Brown runs a very good Brown's English Language College on the Gold Coast, and many others. And so what it means is that many of these students come in on tourist visas or working holiday visas, and they might do 12 weeks of English language, but in equal measure they might go to Griffith University or to Queensland TAFE. And of course, those providers are missing out on the tuition fees, but there's also 240,000 Australians that work in the international education industry. And so, for example, many accommodation providers, you've got purpose-built student accommodation facilities, both on campus and off campus. You've got the tourism sector where international students, do some domestic tourism. And again, the Gold Coast is very much the beneficiary of some of those 740,000 full fee-paying international students around Australia, coming from the southern states to have a holiday on the Gold Coast and further north in Queensland. So really the multiplier effects into the economy of those 740-odd thousand international students are massive. And of course now our borders are closed. We're not getting them to come in on student visas, on working holiday visas, on tourist visas, and therefore many of our, particularly the private providers, but also public unis, are finding a massive revenue hit.
Tell us about our international trade in education services, its value, the most important markets, and their growth in recent years.
Well, I think international education has been sort of a quiet achiever for the national economy. Rather than selling iron ore or coal, what we do is provide education services, and we're very fortunate to have world-class not just universities, but TAFE and private providers. And those world-class education providers provide qualifications that many of these young people can take anywhere in the world to get a job with. Now, crucially, China is our number one market. 35% of those 740,000 full fee-paying students come out of China. That's followed by India, around 17%, Malaysia, Pakistan. But very interestingly, and particularly for the Gold Coast, we've had Latin American students now in our top 10 student markets. So we've got Brazil at number 5, and we've got Colombia sitting around 8 or 9. It's very interesting that the Brazilians don't come to Melbourne. For example, they go to warmer climates.
They do.
Yeah, and you've got many of them in Queensland and the Gold Coast. But then Melbourne gets the Colombians because apparently the weather around Bogota in Colombia is very similar to Melbourne's. So they're quite at home coming to Melbourne. So you don't get many Colombians in Queensland apparently. So it's just interesting the different motivations. Now, what we find too is that whereas the Chinese students will often come for high fee paying university programs at Griffith Uni or at University of Queensland, QUT, etc., what we find is that the students from the subcontinent, be it India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, they will often not have the wherewithal to pay $40,000 a year in tuition fees. So they might, for example, do diplomas or might do a degree at a private provider. So there's no one-size-fits-all model, but certainly different students from different countries. So the Latin Americans, for example, they tend to come and do hospitality diplomas and often work as baristas and in your cafes and hotels, and they will get a world-class diploma in hospitality and hotel management and do some English language while they're here in Australia, and then they'll go home and they can still do their bachelor degree or their master's degree free of charge or very low-cost tuition fees, albeit often in their bankrupt economy, back home. So we find that different countries have students who are looking for different types of enrolment in courses, both public and private provider.
Salvatore Barbonis from the Centre of Independent Studies believe there is a high degree of risk given the huge exposure to the Chinese market. What do you say to that?
I think we often overlook that China is the most populous country in the world, 1.3 billion people. China has a massive appetite for offshore education. Chinese students are the biggest market for the USA universities, for Canada, for UK. So we're not unusual in that regard. And to be honest, other countries like India have got a rising middle class, but because China's had the one-child policy for so long, obviously there's more of often a wherewithal or an ambition to have that one child get a world-class education offshore, whereas for many Indian families, for example, by way of contrast, they might have 5 children and can't justify the investment in one of the 5 children having a high tuition fee paying course over other children. So, yes, we do rely on China, but then look, so does our iron ore industry, so does our coal industry. So we're not unusual there as an industry that's been reliant on China. Despite best efforts for many universities like Griffith, UQ, QUT, and also, of course, University of Southern Cross and, of course, even the Sunshine Coast University, who have done their best to try and recruit from other countries, particularly in our own region, be it from Vietnam, from Indonesia. But so far it's the Chinese that have got the appetite for study.
Any other new markets on the horizon, maybe just to fill in the blank spaces while the China thing settles down again?
It's very challenging. For example, Serena Russo Group that deliver bachelor degrees for James Cook University in Brisbane, they were told by Austrade, look, come to Africa on an Austrade education fair and try and recruit some African students. And speaking to the CEO, who's highly respected in the industry, Kathleen Newcomb, about how that went for them. Serena Russo Group invested a lot of money in going to Africa to recruit and interviewed individual students there and were able to prove the financial ability of those students to come and study from fairly high wealth families, only to discover that they got 0 visas approved from our Home Affairs Department. So it's a vexed issue because on the one hand, Austrade, our marketing arm of government, say, here, come to a new market that's opening up for an Austrade recruitment fair, and then our Immigration and Home Affairs Department may not choose to approve those students' visas.
Which sectors of education are likely to be most affected with the borders being blocked, with students not being able to come out to Australia?
Well, we took heart from the Prime Minister, Mike, announcing that international education, we might be able to get students in the country in the third phase of him opening up the borders, and so we're looking around July for that to happen. Unfortunately, though, that will be based on each state and territory government's proposals that they take to National Cabinet, and it will be based on sign-off from each state and territory government's health officials. Now, we need campuses to reopen. The number one criteria is no new international students or returning international students can come back to Australia unless our campuses are teaching face-to-face student cohorts. That's an obvious criteria, because you don't want international students coming here and being told, well, congratulations, you've got into Australia, but now you're going to be sitting somewhere in your accommodation cell block doing online learning. So the fundamental is campuses have to be open. Number two, we have to have state governments who take forward a proposal, and at this stage we haven't had a proposal from Queensland. I understand work is going on behind the scenes. Shannon Willoughby's leading a working party to try and get Queensland behind the idea. And then we've already got some states, such as South Australia, who've come forward with a concrete proposal that details the quarantine arrangements, and then the government federally will decide which countries have contained the virus, relatively speaking, compared to others, so that it might be safe to bring some students in, subject to a whole raft of quarantine measures you can only guess at, including the minimum 14 days quarantine, either in a hotel or a purpose-built student accommodation facility, so that we can ensure there's no COVID-19 cluster that comes into the country. So the long and the short of that is that I don't want to sort of list countries that might be able to get students through, but clearly if you look at the media, you'll see that countries like South Korea, Taiwan, even China itself are containing the virus relatively well, and maybe some of those countries might qualify to have students come in. But there's a lot of water to go under the bridge yet before we can look to any new cohorts coming in later this year. But we're really pushing hard, Mike, for the February intake, the big one at the start of next year. Keep in mind that our competitors in the Northern Hemisphere, UK, USA, Canada, their main intake date is August. And if you're sitting in their shoes in a university in Europe at the moment, you'd have to wonder whether you're going to have any international students coming through their borders by August.
Very hard to plan such a huge industry, $40 billion in February. Actually, let's go back 1 month, maybe at Christmas. Did you ever think we'd get to this stage where all the planning, because it just doesn't happen over the weekend, that you basically get hold of it and you throw it outside and you have to restart again?
Well, it's quite interesting, because when we had the bushfires, particularly down south in Australia, Dan Tehan, the Education Minister, who's been very good at promoting international education, Dan Tehan phoned me and said, look, what can we do to improve Australia's reputation as a safe study destination country because of the bad image of the bushfires? And so we put together a task force of every state and territory government, all the peak bodies, accommodation providers and so on, and every one of the key federal government departments as well. And our first meeting was about what could we do to mitigate the reputational hit Australia was taking, that the whole of Australia was allegedly on fire. Would you believe there were maps being published in Chinese social media and in America that literally showed Cairns and Toowoomba and so on, all affected by the bushfires, when it's a very, very different situation on the ground. So my task force that I was asked to chair, beavered away for about 2 weeks on the bushfires, and then Minister Tehan phoned me and said, look, Phil, do you think you might be able to add this COVID-19 issue to your list of, and of course it's just been furiously peddling ever since on COVID-19, and trying to show that Australia will probably come out having contained the virus relatively well compared to other countries, and therefore we should be seen as a safe, welcoming country for parents to send their children to.
Perception, I would imagine, is such an important part, the perception of us being safe with bushfires. I mean, I could see fires down Burke Street. It's just terrible. But that part was overblown, yet we have COVID-19, this deadly disease, and we're actually regarded as being a very safe place to send your children, except you can't get your children in.
And look, there's no doubt that a lot of the wider Australian community would be concerned, given all the sacrifices that have been made, if we just suddenly open up the borders to foreign nationals coming in an ad hoc manner. So we're looking to each state and territory government's medical experts in discussions with state premiers and territory chief ministers to say, okay, we think you could have a small number of international full fee paying students come in, hopefully July, August, maybe for trimester in October, to prove up the model of pilot programs before we have a bigger intake, hopefully in Feb next year. But crucially, we'll need to bring them in, Mike, even before February. We'll need to bring them in early January in order for them to be able to do English language preparatory classes. Of course, many of the students that go on to university and TAFE have to prove up their English language ability by doing 10 weeks of English language, whatever, beforehand, either at a private English language college on the Gold Coast or at Griffith University, for example, or Southern Cross University's English language centres.
I always tell my, having lived in the States for a fair bit, they say, what's the main difference between the rest of the world and Australia? And I say that we don't move our lips when we talk. So maybe that could be part of like lip exercises in the English language classes, just so that when they go home, people can understand what they're saying.
Yeah, well, it's a good point. I was a Rotary Exchange student for a year in Tokyo, Japan when I was 17, before I came back and went to university in Australia. And I used to tell my Japanese classmates that in Australia we speak perfect English. And when they asked me to explain that, I said, well, we're at the midpoint between American slang and very pompous British English language pronunciation. So I argued that I was proven correct because at the time on the bullet trains right across Japan, the pre-recorded English voice to tell you what station you're coming to or whatever was actually an Australian voice, and the CNN TV station beamed out of Asia and America had a preponderance of Australian journos employed. So I argued, well, there you go. We're seen to be a very understandable form of English language. I didn't tell them it's probably because Australians were willing to take cheaper pay rates from CNN.
That's right. Well, we were. We needed the overseas exposure. We heard that dim sum was actually fantastic in Hong Kong. So no, it's all. I mean, the industry itself is such a strong industry, $40 billion and growing, and we really need that to get back on track. And I suppose.
But more important, Mike, just on that, we worry in our industry about talking about the dollar figure, and that's an ABS figure. Mm-hmm. But more importantly, what we're doing is we're really providing future leaders of our own region, right across the Indo-Pacific, with exposure to the Australian way of life, to the way we go about things, to being, a culturally diverse, inclusive part of the new world. Mm-hmm. And at any one time, you can find a third of the Indonesian or Malaysian cabinet ministers have been educated in Australia already. So that's got to be good for Australia in terms of soft power and diplomacy going forward. And many of these young people, as I discovered in Japan, are taught by rote learning. So you bow to the teacher at the start of the lesson, you take copious notes, you don't dare ask a question, and you bow to the teacher on the way out the door. And in Australia, we've got this wonderful teaching, or they call it a pedagogical advantage, where we do encourage critical thinking, creative learning, working in project-based team groups, when you're studying here. And that's exactly what global employers now want. They want resilient young people who can work in teams from different cultures together. So it's a real dividend that we've got, if you like. We just have to, I guess, communicate the benefits of what we're doing with International Education Australia to the wider community, and educate people like Pauline Hanson that we're not a threat. We're actually a great advantage for Australia going forward.
Phil Honeywood, CEO of the International Education Association of Australia, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
We're talking business, nothing but talk.
This is the Coast Business Radio Podcast.